We recognise the Kaurna people as the custodians of the lands and waters of the Adelaide region and pay our respects to elders past and present. We acknowledge and respect the Kaurna people's cultural, spiritual, physical and emotional connection with their land, waters and community, and we extend that respect to all Aboriginal and First Nations people. Amy And is a podcast that explores all kinds of bookish things, and that can include some pretty adult content. So please be aware that some of this content will be not safe for work or for young ears, and be careful who's listening when you are. Welcome back to Amy And. I'm Amy Matthews, and this month we're looking at climate fiction, which sounds really fun, but actually is a lot more fun than it sounds. And I'm here today with Payton Hogan.
Hi.
And Millie Heffernan.
That's me.
And we have an extra special guest hostie, Melanie Ross.
Hey.
Hey. So Melanie, for those of you, you're only meeting Melanie for the first time today, but we know her very well. Melanie's doing a PhD at Flinders University, and she's looking at the forest imagination and actually writing, would you call it a climate fiction book?
Yes, definitely. Yes. Most definitely.
So why? What makes it a climate fiction book?
Because it looks at the story of a forest and the focus on the forest, and the people are very secondary in it. And it runs all the way from 1915 till about 2040. So we are getting increasingly into, yes, well, that's the thing, human time, human years. We're getting increasingly into the climate change effects.
Cool. So let's just start there because this is fascinating. What is a forest imagination?
So my idea of forest imagination is a world, an imagination in which the forest is at the forefront. It's the main character, it's the driver, the challenge is what you'd normally expect would happen within a story that happens in terms of the forest, and the people are kind of pushed to the side a bit. So it very much leans into the post-human. It's experimental because you think, how on earth do you write about a forest for all this time? But we tend to forget, the forest, they're living beings. They do have histories, they do have stories, and there's so much more work out there around different species and where they come from, what they're used for. And inevitably, humans are tied up in all of that. I don't think you could argue that there's any plant on the planet, tree on the planet, that isn't somehow related to people because of what we do to our world. But yes, in this, it's the forest at the front. It's not just a pretty setting, not just something where people go to hide themselves or other stuff or kind of feel threatened and attacked by it, which we know from some Gothic literature.
I love that. It's not the setting, it's the character.
Absolutely.
I love that.
Yep.
So how did you pick the character you picked? So if there are all these trees in the world and all these forests in the world, which forest did you choose to be your main character?
Okay. So I'm Australian. So I've grown up around lots of different native Australian forest settings. I've grown up in the tropics, I've grown up around sort of native bushland, temperate, and then as well as southern forest. And I wanted to choose something that indeed was more foreign to me. And things that are foreign to me are indeed pine trees. So in South Australia, we have pine plantations, and there is a plantation that's closer to Adelaide that I went to a couple of times as a kid. But later on in life, over in Kangaroo Island, other places, would come across these forests, and they were just so different to me. Really straight, you can see between all the trees, there was something different about it. So I knew to...
And they were all plantations, all the ones that were straight?
Yes.
Yep.
Yes. I haven't come across, until I went to the US, I hadn't come across a native pine forest.
So what's the difference between a native, so the straight lines, but how does a plantation forest work? What's different about a plantation forest to a regular forest?
Okay, so a plantation forest is predominantly there for product. So, and Australia has a lot of pine plantations, so predominantly radiata pine, which is what I specialise in. So Australia, New Zealand, Chile and some other countries. And those trees are there, people can access the areas as for recreational purposes, but predominantly they are there for product. structural timber, paper. So whether it be toilet paper, other kinds of paper, other products, furniture, but predominantly sort of structural timber. So that needs to come from somewhere. So they're planted. There are different stages at which they're thinned. So some of the trees are then converted into other products. And then eventually towards the end of the life of that forest, they're completely felled. And they're then used for, bigger things like structural timber. So it's a forest that exists for the purpose of people, and people can be there and explore it in the meantime.
So in your novel, your forest is a plantation forest?
It is a plantation forest, but it it actually, for many other reasons, it actually doesn't get felled. But it originally starts out as a plantation forest.
Yeah,
yes.
right.
Interesting. Are we able to bring it back to, in case, because this is the first episode of the month, I feel like not many people will know what climate fiction means. I don't know a lot about it. I feel like
Great
it's something
question,
that's
Payton.
probably
I've got that from further down, but we would dive straight into the forest.
Sorry.
No, I totally
No,
forgot.
I love hearing about the forest talk. 'Cause I assume it's probably super self-explanatory and we'll all be like, oh, okay. But like, is there anything that people will probably recognize? Anything that people have probably already seen that's really mainstream climate fiction? Or is it
This
kind
is
of
great. This
new?
gets right into our questions that we thought
Yeah.
about.
Yeah. So, I mean, how would you guys describe climate fiction? If you had to just come up with a potted description off the top of your head, what's climate fiction?
I mean, it's got to have some climate in it. It's got to have some kind of link to climate.
To the climate
To
crisis?
Climate change, to climate crisis. I feel like to the climate crisis, for me
Yeah.
to consider it climate fiction.
Do you have, if you had to think off the top of your head, what does this book look like? What are you imagining plot, character, setting is looking like? Melanie's going to have a different answer.
Yeah,
'cause
it's
she's done a lot of
Well,
research.
I was just thinking, I know what I'd like climate fiction to look like, but I think the ones that I think of tend to be disaster. Humans have gone too far and now we're suffering crisis because of our own actions. I'm sure that's not all climate fiction.
I know.
That's
I'm
what I
like,
think of.
I'm like Mad Max, Waterworld.
yeah.
Right, Mad Max would be okay because that's a super mainstream thing.
That's
When
not
you
really
probably-
climate.
yeah,
That's
crisis,
like apocalyptic. But I think we've linked climate crisis and apocalypse.
which is
Yeah,
interesting.
100%.
Yeah.
But it doesn't have to be that, I don't think. I think that's just what people think of when you say climate fiction.
Yeah. Is it like the climate is some sort of impetus to the plot? Like it kind of is important to the plot and the characters. Yeah,
Important to the
okay.
plot. Actually, Melanie said something the other day which I loved, and I would love for me to prompt you to repeat it, but about climate fiction not necessarily being a genre, but I think you said a mode. I loved that thought because I've been thinking of it as a genre, and then when I switched to thinking of it as a mode, it really opened up what I was thinking about as climate fiction.
Because I think when it's a mode, it's that context that everything is set in, and there is something that, and it doesn't necessarily, once again, have to be like the big push, the big driver of the story, but something that people are having to navigate in some way. And I think something I noticed more recently, it can be some of the quieter things. And I think the great thing with the quieter things is actually that's what we experience in the now, the here and the now. It's something we can relate to. So the apocalyptic is something that's so far forward, and humans are just not very good at projecting themselves so far forward into something that's so foreign. I think that's when it gets really interesting, when it's the things that we can relate to. And I think something, and I can't recall a book at the moment, but a title, but some of those that are looking at bees and some of the changes in bees, the movement of bees and the effect on food. So it might just be, bees are not in a garden or something. It could be something really subtle, but they're the things that we can link to. They're things we can relate to. And you can see how it could be woven to everything.
Yeah.
That makes me think Charlotte Wood had a piece, can't remember where it was, whether it was Sydney Morning Herald or somewhere, right during the Sydney fires in 2019. And it was just a piece about hanging out the laundry and the smell of the smoke and how the smell of the smoke kind of took over everything. It was just in the weft of everything. And I remember thinking, now that is a brilliant piece of climate fiction. I mean, I don't even know if it's fiction or memoir, but it was a brilliant bit of climate writing because it was so ingrained in the ordinary. Do you know, like you could relate to it because you know what it feels like to be folding your sheets and you can, and that feeling of not being able to breathe as well. Like even your sheets can't breathe. I thought that was brilliant.
That was going to be one of my questions sort of before I changed my thinking about climate fiction. But do you think that the more apocalyptic climate fiction kind of disconnects it from reality for people? Like it really pushes it into the fictional space because you're thinking, well, that's not going to happen. Crazy tidal waves and breaking the earth apart. I'm thinking of 2012, the movie. Catastrophizes it so much that people push it completely into the fictional sphere. Whereas, like you said, with the more subtle, it really is stuff that's happening around us every day. You can contextualize it more.
And I think there's that hard balance as well, as we know that there's a number of populations, island populations in the world, and people are already leaving and they're climate refugees.
Yeah.
But because that doesn't hit the mainstream news, people are not aware of it. So that's the hard thing. For some people, it's kind of already reached somewhat of an apocalypse.
Yeah.
People are losing their homelands.
I'm thinking of the LA fires recently. Recently-ish. Like that is, the photos are devastating. But that is apocalyptic levels of climate crisis. But not everyone still thinks of it that way. People are just like, oh, crazy fires. But why? Why are the fires so crazy?
Or even where we live, we've had this summer with no rain, right? 2 days of rain for months and months and months. And everything just feels dry. Like that's stuff you don't think about. Your skin is dry. The earth is dry. Everything's dusty and
plants
dry.
are doing so worse than they were 12 months ago.
Yeah.
Because everything's so dry.
The air is so dry.
And I think, and maybe is that part of what makes it really hard is, like, I was only talking to an American colleague this morning, and where she comes from, there's water everywhere, and we're not used to that. So the climate affects slightly different places. So how can you then explore something that everyone can relate to? So for us as South Australians, the driest state and driest continent, whereas up in sort of North America, towards Canada, and I'm in Canada, what are their climate change effects?
The East Coast here has had, what do they call it? Like the river of rain in the sky?
Yes.
Oh, yeah,
What's it called?
flood.
Can't remember.
No,
It's
I
got
can't
a name.
remember either.
But
Yeah.
the idea that there's these new rivers of rain in the sky that just deluge certain states.
This makes me think of why people had to stop calling it global warming and start calling it climate change, because not everywhere feels warm at the same time, but overall it is warming up.
Yes. But it was a huge misconception. So people would use that as the argument. Well, it's getting colder where I am.
Yeah.
Well, yes, but because it's getting warmer in other places.
Yeah.
Science.
Yes.
Yeah.
Science. So, Melanie, when you were thinking about writing your climate fiction, obviously you had different models than the apocalyptic to turn to. So can you talk about maybe some of the literature that inspired you or that you've been thinking about? Or theory?
I think it's a lot of the inspirations come from just experience. So when I was thinking about how on earth did I come to writing this book around forest, and indeed paying very little attention to the people, and my photography is how I came to it. So this curiosity that's throughout my photos for the last sort of 15 years, and so much of that has been focused on landscape and then on trees. So I think there hasn't been work out there. The science has been really interesting to learn, around plantations, how things work, the native plantations, the native pines rather in Monterey, and we've got them here and the differences. So I think it's a lot of it's been the science that's actually driven my interest in it, because I can see that there's the quiet story that comes out through it, and that there's like ecological histories, there's written histories of forest, because if we're talking about England, it's an entirely different context. A forest is a place where deer roam, where royalty hunts. That was actually one of the definitions of forest.
Wow.
So
Again, it's so interesting
foreign.
that it's all related to the human usage, like how we can extract or use it.
Yeah, and I think I read somewhere along the line that there's not a single square inch in England, I don't know about further afield than that hasn't been influenced in some way by people.
Yeah.
So we're fortunate here that we still have a number of spaces and forests that indeed are not particularly influenced by people. But yeah, in some countries it's quite a different story. But yeah, I found that there isn't sort of a lot out there that talks about things, and in that slow way, because when you're talking about forest, when that is your focus, things are slow. Things happen in ways that us as humans can't see. What goes on below the ground, what goes on and up in a canopy. We can't reach those, and it's just everyday people who are walking along kind of our part.
Yeah. So, I mean, I've got so many thoughts, I don't even know where to begin. Thinking about experimental fiction and how there are like the two faces of it, right? There's the writer's side of it, that you're experimenting and you've got this really challenging task of like, I want to represent a forest and the forest's experience, and I've got this long time span, and I've chosen this one specific patch of place and these things. But then you've got the reader on the other side, and I think you're probably still in the writer experience at the moment because you're still writing it. But I just thought, I don't know if even there's a question there, but that's quite a big difference.
How do you write the story of trees when you have to use human language to express it, you know?
And that's what's very tricky. And there's tiny nuance in language. It's so hard because I don't want to reveal too much because it's something that I work with. But what I can say is, it's nuances in language. And I think if I add a whole nother angle to that is, I'm not an ecologist, I'm not a biologist. I have, long time ago, some background in like early sort of undergraduate university. So how do you then approach that as a creative? Is a whole other angle on it. So crazily, it's driven by human experience and human observation.
Yeah.
Pulling together what we know from science, what others have done, but actually through human experience and keen observation. And I'm talking many dozens and dozens of hours in different modes of forest. What happens in these places? What is it that can be revealed, but also revealed in a way like a normal everyday person, which I am. I'm not a biologist, I'm not an ecologist. How can that translate? And also the flick of it, like, there's so many scientific terms that I could take on board and I understand, but does that actually really explain anything? Not necessarily.
You've hit the nail right on the head of another question that I had. Not a question, but sort of a thought that I had about how climate crisis is so just steeped in science. It's so scientific, and I feel like that's why it's so hard for us, the general populace, to grasp what's really happening and how bad it is and all the little separate parts that are happening. I live with a scientist, so I hear a lot about it, but they're a science communicator. And it's why I feel like it's so important for creatives to be writing stuff like this and to be getting into stuff like this, because you are able to, hopefully, I imagine you will, successfully translate it for the general populace, but still not necessarily. I wonder how difficult it is, like you were saying, not to water down the science too much while still trying to do it in an approachable way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's something that when we think about what speculative fiction can do, and across like topics like space, and we know that that's been huge in fiction currently. There's more coming out, and we have Orbital. And I think that was an example of something that's well out of the realms for most of us, but was able to be converted into language and concepts that we can connect with. Yeah. And I think some of it's also pushing people's ideas. So, and also not necessarily explaining everything, because I think that's one of the most important parts for me. I don't want to pretend that I know everything that happens, because indeed that's me as a human pretending I know what it's like to be a tree. I do not know what it's like to be a tree. Yeah. And anyone who does, and some people might, and there's lots of people with different spiritual connections, but I can feel pretty certain that no one is actually literally a tree. There's so much that we'll never know. Yeah. So how do you kind of capture that and make that clear? And I love the unknown.
Yeah.
Bring it on. I'm happy with the unknown and not necessarily having answers.
I'm
cool with that.
Leave some of it unsaid. Let people think about it.
There's like a tension between wanting to represent something well and having the freedom as an artist to make your own choices and take some liberties to provide, I don't know, your own unique take on it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll extend that further. And the reader,
Yes.
So I'm getting into kind of non-representational theory territory.
Oh my goodness.
And
Just a little light reading.
Yeah, we won't go into
What is
that.
that?
Yes, no, we're
I
not
thought
going to go into that
post-human
too
was
much.
wild.
There's
But
a term for everyone to Google.
And I think it's so that there's space that's left for the reader, because there's something else about when we say things too much, and we know that as fiction writers around show, when you're writing into the environmental humanities, and that's very much where I'm situated, you want to allow space for people also to be able to connect to their own experiences, their own ideas, and to be able to sit concepts. So sometimes that's another argument for keeping things a little bit more open, and doing that through language, and doing that through not providing the answers. So there's a whole other edge to show.
So it's like
through
keeping
environmental
things a bit
humanities.
abstract kind of thing. Is that what you do as a writer, like using
poetic.
abstract kinds
Would you
of?
say more poetic?
Yes, I would definitely use wordplay. So there's a rhythm, as we know, in language, and there's a tone in language, and what that does is that in itself, as a reader's going, it's kind of that leads other places, and double meanings, and just it comes out in another way, but also connects to other ideas. So people kind of have to play with it a little bit in their heads, really.
I'm so excited to read it.
I was about to say, I want to read this so bad.
Yeah,
I'm very lucky I get to read it.
Yes. And I feel like this would be a great thing to read for like a book club, because if everyone's doing their own work as a reader, then you would all have such different interpretations, and it would be so much fun to discuss your interpretation of
contrast.
Yeah.
It's definitely fun to write.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely fun to write, because I'm finding that The Forest was written first. I wrote The Forest, which made great sense to me. That's the dominant. And now I'm winding in, because inevitably everything is tied up with a human in some way. How does that kind of come through and sort of creep in? And it's really interesting what these people are getting up to, which I didn't expect, but I'm keeping them at a distance.
Bloody
so
people.
that's fun.
Can I just say, I feel like I don't hear enough authors say this was really fun to write. I really like hearing that. I feel like a lot of the time it's like, oh, and then I had to write this and I had to get this done. I like just hearing, and I had fun writing it. It was fun to play with the writing.
Or they say nothing at all about the process.
That's true. The other extreme.
So I know you you loved writing The Forest first. Like that came with its own challenges, but it was a mode of writing. Mm-hmm. What were the challenges of shifting from forest to human?
Well, and I think that's the thing, and this is all going to be written up, which is, there's so much I can write about from the research elements. So I'm reflecting on the process as I go, and they are both so intertwined. But now by seeing how I can pull the two together, and they're actually running in parallel, there's things that I'm aware of for The Forest that I wasn't aware of before. There's things that I'm aware of. Hang on, no, those people won't do that. So looking at how, because the people are secondary, they're to the side. They don't get many words at all. But how are they influenced? So how are they influencing the environment? How is it influencing them?
So when you started out, though, I think the humans they kept rising up a little bit more. Like they had more time on the page.
Yes.
And over time, you've pruned them back out of the forest. Can you talk a little bit about that process? Like, was it a feeling that a book should have like that? How do you drive the narrative without human agency? Or
and I think that's the hard thing is, as a reader. And I read experimental fiction, but as a reader who predominantly, for most of my life, as all of us, we take in human-driven narratives. That's all very normal. So you there's something that flicks in your head. It's something I can relate to. It runs. Whereas when I'm looking at The Forest in this other way, and there's a certain headspace I have to go into, and one that is very much observational. What is it that's going on? What it does is it forces me to go, hang on, but why would I all of a sudden be talking about this and that with this person? Like, no, what has that got to do with The Forest? That's human experience, that's fine. And what I've done is actually situated as much as possible within the forest, so that it means that they have to have a good reason for being there. There has to be also really good reason as to why do they get words and The Forest doesn't.
yeah.
So I think that has been interesting, thinking about, well, is this really important? So same as if you've got like any character, why are they there? What is this? What purpose is it serving? How does this relate to indeed the goals and the
if
drive
the forest
of the
is
forest?
the main, if it's the forest story, how are they impacting the forest? Like they're only there for the forest. Really.
Yes. Yeah. And how and what are they serving? Like in what way is that going to help or hinder, or perhaps have nothing to do with the forest, but in some way the people leave their mark. So that's how sort of the people have fallen away, and they are just a small number of words, but they're mighty hard words to write.
Yeah.
Because they're the visitors. They're the visitors. They're not going to be there. It's got to have some substance. And they've got to have a good reason for being there too.
Like any good minor character.
Exactly. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Can you tell us a little bit about your research process? Because I know you did lots of, I'm really interested actually for you to talk about 2 field trips. This is a very leading question. But you've done a lot of field trips to this one specific forest here in Australia, and then you've done another one in the US. And I just thought you could talk us through as a writer, because it's research and creativity mixed together. They're not separated. It's all happening. Like your research has a creativity through every step, whether it's photography, audio recordings, writing the novel, about what it's like to go on those field trips in that capacity.
Well, and that's sort of how I found the top. That's how I really, I was at the top of a hill with my dad, and we were back in one of the old plantation forestry sites where it was an experimental forest, and that's actually where I found the real drive for the book and what it was always going to be, and the story of a forest. With going into the forest, and so it started with plantation forest here in South Australia. I went in there going, I'd like to explore this space. This is super challenging. How on earth am I going to do it? But I went in there with the attitude of, I'm just going to see what's there. I'm going to walk around, and as a photographer, I'm used to looking at things, but I'm going to look at, and I'm going to be experiencing, and also I'm a big walker. So for me to be moving, that puts my head in a different mode because I'm actually participating in some way. So there's a lot of walking research. We know that walking contributes to headspace and creativity and ideas, but also the embodied act of being in another space to be sharing that ground and walking through. So I went in there with no concept, with no ideas. I would explore and see what would happen. And I found there was a sign I found which explained, because I went in there with knowing not a lot.
Can I just go back a little bit and set the scene? So when you're there on a hill with your dad, whereabouts, which state is the forest in?
That was in South Australia.
South Australia.
Yeah, that was one of the previous experimental forests.
Yep.
So one of the reasons why things started in South Australia is South Australia very early on adopted plantation forestry, and I feel bad that I cannot remember the name, but we're talking like the
we can put it in the
year.
show notes.
It's in the mid 1800s.
Yeah,
because
that is really early,
super early. Native forests, when there was European settlement, native forests, there already wasn't a lot here.
Yeah.
And then, of course, as European settlers do, they started cutting them down. So they worked out really early that needed to be preserved. So they were looking at options for plantation forests. So South Australia, out of the whole world, was a very early adopter of plantation forestry, and they had to test it out. What's actually going to work here? Where could it be? So there's a couple of places where they did some experimental forest work, which is where they tested out what could work sort of en masse, and then it led to plantings in a number of places, but that's part of the legacy of the Green Triangle and Mount Gambier.
Yeah,
which must have taken, like you said, everything that happens in the forest is very slow. Must have taken ages to find out what worked and to experiment. I'm just thinking, like, what's the timeline there?
Yes,
long.
Yes, and it's fascinating what they did try, and I will put it in the show notes because I feel so bad because it was a field trip
here
about 18 months ago, and there are still some of those stands that are there, and there's also a forestry museum, I guess you could call it, that's on the way to Mount Gambier, and it gives you an example of some of the different kinds of trees that they tried. And when these particular ones were planted, and of course some of them took off and some of them haven't, so you can actually go and see these trees. You know when they're planted, you look at them, you can compare them, so you can kind of engage in what sort of process was involved with that, which is fascinating.
Any of this is fascinating.
So yes, that then led to me spending time in the forest, and observation is the biggest part of what I do, and I observe in terms of my position as a visitor in this place, photographs. I collect soundscape as well, so I can get a whole other understanding. So that's to kind of hone my attention because, and Dr. Hannah Pitt is one of the researchers who has very much, and it's been so useful to me in understanding, well, what can we learn? How can we go into this space? And it's about, well, what can we be taught? What can we learn? What can plants show us, not only through our engagement, but also through the people who are experts, who have worked with plants for a really long time. So it's got that. I've got that learning mindset.
Yeah.
So I tends to be about 2 hours at a time. Just because I get hungry and I need to rest, and I don't take chairs.
Yeah.
I've learned a lot about the logistics of what stuff you can take with you on field
You'd be
trips.
a great person to hike with.
I've
So
learned a
prepared.
lot. Yes, and then the US added a whole other thing, California,
Oh my
with some of the rules
goodness.
over there. Yes, so that's what I do. Sometimes I'll go in with people. Sometimes it'll be alone. But people always know where I am because, once again, I choose forest spaces. But even when I'm in the middle of a forest and I'm the only person there and that's it, I won't see anyone for 2 hours, I'm keenly aware that there's like planes overhead.
Yeah.
Gunshots, unfortunately, in one of the forests that I visit, sometimes there's deer hunting down the road. And even just knowing that I'm carrying a phone, and so like I'm on a GPS.
Yeah.
So I'm bringing this digital technology into there. So there's a lot that comes out in terms of, well, what does this mean about a person in this space?
I was wondering if you could tell the story. You told me a story once that has stuck with me about how there is scheduled for felling regularly and that you don't know when it's going to happen. So you form this relationship to certain areas of the forest.
Yes.
I was wondering if you could talk about that.
My heart is already breaking.
Yes.
Oh, God.
So that was something I was keenly aware of. There was a forest I did unofficial field work, which kind of got into my imagination a long time ago on Kangaroo Island. And I skipped a fence and it was a plantation forest. And that actually went down when the fires came through in end of 2019, early 2020. So I already knew what it was like for a place to be
To lose
completely
something.
decimated. So when you're around a big plantation area like Green Triangle, you do see blocks of land that have recently been felled, so they're fallow, they're getting prepared. You see ones that have recently been planted. So very quickly you get used to the idea that, things are at lots of different stages. And I didn't know if I really wanted to know if my study site was going to be gone, because I thought, oh gosh, I could actually turn up and it's not here.
Yeah.
I'm actually very confident that I'm going to be okay. But yes, in the near
Are we
future,
though? Are we going to be okay?
in the near future, in the next 3 to 5 years, it will not be there anymore.
Yeah.
But then you've got
Wow.
the haunting of it, right? Because it will still be there for you because you've had such a long experience with it.
And not only that, but the land has been changed by the trees just being there. You know,
And it's
they're
interesting.
gone, but their effect is there.
Yeah. It's interesting to think about how, like, the average person probably isn't developing a relationship to the land like that, which is such a white colonial thing, like being so disconnected from nature. And that makes me think about other impacts that your type of writing can have to help people rebuild that relationship to the land again, and then how that changes our perspective on it and our respect for it, and how much we care about climate change and stuff like that.
How much does it change the feeling? Because obviously these are trees that are planted for a purpose. You know that eventually they will be felled. So how does that change when you're talking about, I don't know if this is a real question. It's a first draft question. First draft thought. How does that change compared to forests that are just forests, that are natural forests? You know, you don't have that expectation. Those trees are supposed to be there forever, even though sometimes they're not. How does that feeling change between different types of forests?
And I think that was one of the really good things with going to the native radiata pine forests in Monterey. And it was quite amazing because there are trees there that are 3 times as old as any of the trees that I'd seen in the plantation. So it's kind of, that was nice to sort of see the other extent of it in the preservation of, and seeing some trees and, you know, that are well over 100 years old, whereas the max that I would sort of see around where I do my research is maybe 40.
Can we
Wow,
can we
what a
take a
difference.
minute there, because that's really interesting. It connects to Payton's point around developing a connection to country, because it's not just that you've got this connection to forest or trees, it's the radiata pine, right? Which now that I've met you, I know a lot about it. And also I would never have noticed it before and known what it was, and now I feel I have this relationship to this tree because of your work. But I was wondering if you could talk about the radiata pine a little bit, and how, because that's the relationship you're actually having is with the radiata pine, and you know so much about this pine. And then, as you said, you went to the US to see it kind of in its natural habitat. Yeah.
And I think straight away, something that comes to all of that is context. So depending on which context we're in, so me as an Australian where things are a plantation, and it's a long way from where I live, so it's 5 hours to get where I do my research. Whereas if you're in Monterey, and indeed they're a native tree and they're all around you, and they're in the car parks at the supermarkets.
Oh, wow.
They're at the airport.
So did you like get off the plane? You're like, "Hi, honey."
Yeah, I was like, wow, this is crazy. So my relationship with that particular tree, that's been quite hard to navigate, and I don't know how I would have done that if I hadn't done all my forest time, because the majority of what is written is not so much about the species itself, it's more about how it can be grown.
Right.
And what's happening genetically, and how can we manage forests. So there's not a lot of work that sort of sits outside specifically about radiata pine. It's all sitting very closely in that scientific. And of course there's the work, and there's a wonderful book that's written by the Monterey Pine Conservation Group. But otherwise it's all science. So if I was just trying to gather some relationship based on the articles that I was reading, I don't know if I would have been able to do that. I had to be there, had to see them, whereas there's lots of other trees. Oaks, there's lots written about oaks and elms, and in an artistic manner outside of science, but because everything sits that way, I couldn't kind of gather that relationship by wading myself through the science, wading myself through that language.
You actually had to have the physical relationship.
I had to go, I had to develop that myself.
Yeah. It's interesting about this pine too, because of the globalization aspect. Do you want to talk about where, like, clearly it's native to California?
Yes.
But where is it most commonly found?
I believe, people can look it up, but I believe that New Zealand is the dominant country, because they do really well.
Yeah. And is it because it's a plantation tree, like sheep or cows are?
As a plantation tree.
Yeah, right.
So it's a huge industry, chili, I know as well. And because there's so much demand, and this is interesting, it comes back to the climate change idea. Plastics, there's a move, of course, to try and eliminate them as much as possible. Yeah. So paper wood products are then part of that shift. So then you need to have more plantations.
Is that toilet paper made from these pines as well?
I don't know about that.
I have a feeling you said something really early on about a toilet paper plantation.
There is a stage in the thinning process, I believe, that it can go into pulp and it can become toilet paper.
Because I felt really stupid, but I was like, oh yeah, I hadn't thought about that. That they have forests where they grow our toilet paper. That's weird.
But that kind of comes to plant blindness or plant disparity, and not recognizing that we're surrounded by it, and even like we can't see, and a lot of the timber that comes out of the plantations where I do my research, it's structural, it's like the top of the top. So it gets used for making houses. Yeah, so for so many of us, without us realising, we're actually surrounded by those trees, but just in another form.
That makes me think of every time I tell someone that Australia is currently in a paper shortage thing, they don't believe me. They're like, where do you think the paper comes from? They have to grow the trees.
They have to grow the trees. We're running out of time, but I just want to ask really quickly, if people would like to go read some climate fiction, have you got a couple of recommendations you could offer?
Yes, definitely. And now, Greenwood by Michael Christie.
Greenwood, okay.
Yes, Overstory by Richard Powers.
Which we're giving away this month for those of you who are paying attention.
Yes. Which is excellent. And they're the ones that always jump to mind because, of course,
about
Their
forests.
forests.
Beautiful.
That's fair.
So if you've loved hearing about Melanie's talk about the forest imagination and forest climate fiction, highly recommend Greenwood or Overstory, which we are giving away this month. But really, thank you for joining me, Payton, Millie, and extra special thanks to Melanie. We'll put up some show notes on the website if you want to go and have a look at some of the sources Melanie has. Maybe we can include a link to one of your websites or some photos or something. But thanks for joining us to introduce Cli-Fi Month.
I'm going to dream of trees.
Oh, do.
Be great
It's
dreams.
fun. It's a beautiful way to spend time.